the format is quite simple. I have a few concept slides, which I'll cover at the beginning. And then we will shift gears and talk about 4 or 5 specific scenarios where Azure and the enterprise make sense. And I will conceptually describe that scenario, and then Jack is going to actually show you that scenario. Sounds good? And please stop us if you have questions. If you have too many questions, I might ask you to hold on till the end because I want to show all the 5 scenarios. But like I said, we are happy to stay after the session, answer more questions. I want you to get as much as you can from this session. So a couple of concept slides out of the way. Why are we considering cloud, of course? And this is, if you've gone to any Azure session, or frankly, if you've gone to any public cloud session, you've seen this slide. We are doing this because we want the agility. How many times you have wanted to build an application and then time comes to deploy it? You don't have the necessary hardware. You go ask for hardware and it takes 6 weeks to go get that hardware if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, you will not get that hardware. The other thing is scale, right? And people ask this question all the time. What is the difference between cloud and my traditional ASP model where I could go to Rackspace and not to be unfair to Rackspace. Rackspace has a cloud offering now, but I'm talking about Rackspace's ASP style offering, which has been in existence for many years. You go to them, you ask for 2 servers, and you sign a contract for 6 months. And if you want to change it, you call them, you change the contract. But here, when we talk about scale, we should be able to fire an API and get a new machine within minutes. There is no, more contract and things like that. You want that to happen quickly. And the third thing is economics. You only want to pay for what you use, and as soon as you shut a machine down, you should not be paying for it. So these 3 factors are really what are engendering an interest in the cloud and move towards the cloud. So, in fact, the things that I said in the previous slide, they really represent the challenges that IT faces today, right? One of the things that IT faces, of course, is, I have all these different kinds of applications. How do I integrate them? My landscape is getting complex. How do I manage it? Somebody is asking for additional capacity. How do I do capacity planning? How do I add new resources? And then how do I think about compliance? It's great that I can provision these machines in the cloud, but what happens to my compliance? How do I be sure that the same policies are being applied to the machines that are hosted in the cloud? Are they part of my same domain? Can I serve up group policies to them? Can I do endpoint protection to the machines in the cloud like I can do to the machines on premises? Okay? So the challenges that IT is facing. And of course, if you look at what Windows Azure is, it is a global platform. In fact, this slide needs to be updated. There are 2 more data centers in the US. No, actually that's right. There are 2 more data centers in the US, totally 8 data centers, and more coming. And if you look at these data centers, it's quite interesting. I don't know if you've been to one. I had the opportunity to visit a data center in Northern Virginia. Quite an interesting thing. In fact, if you drive by a data center, you won't even know that there is this huge data center here because they don't necessarily put big name tags and stuff like that. I drove to this data center, and a giant data center with thousands and hundreds and thousands of machines, and then the number of employees that manage that is really small. In fact, if you look at a traditional IT shop, the number of people required to manage a machine, so the ratio of machines by an IT administrator is somewhere between 20 or 30 machines per IT administrator, and ratio here is more like 400, 500 to 1,000 machines even, because a lot of that is automated. What was interesting to me was as soon as I entered that building, on the left-hand side, there was this huge container, a fuel container, and they were describing to us that the power supply to this data center comes from 2 different power companies. So I was saying, what is this fuel tank here? Well, if even the 2 power supply companies fail to deliver power to that data center, then they have enough fuel to run this data center in its entirety for 2 weeks. That's what that fuel tank is about. So just as an example to give you the kinds of redundancy that has been built in, very hard to replicate that ourselves, certainly outside the reach of most corporations, unless you're a large agency or a big enterprise. And too fast. The orange dots are global CDNs, and CDN stands for Content Delivery Network, so you can serve content from an edge location, be closer to your customers. And then what is interesting about the platform is, and I believe this is unique to the Windows Azure platform, is actually they transact in different currencies. And this diagram shows you all the currencies that they transact. Okay, so that was, let me change gears here. That was what is cloud computing, what are the benefits of cloud computing, how is IT looking at it, what are the problems they're trying to solve. What is Windows Azure is a global platform of data centers. And one thing I should have mentioned in the previous slide, you see all these data centers. What is interesting is one common group manages all of the data centers called the Global Foundation Services. And that's very smart, because if the Global Foundation Services gets that compliance is available across all data centers. So you probably read last month that Windows Azure Data Center have now something called the FedRAMP compliance, which is a big thing if you're building applications for federal agencies. And if you see how that was administered, it was administered at the Global Foundation Services team. And by virtue of the certification being applied to the Global Foundation Services team, that FedRAMP certification is available to a data center in Singapore, for example. And you would say, why would Singapore want a US federal government standard? They may not, their requirements will not say FedRAMP certification, but turns out that all the things that you do to achieve that certification are important for any data center. You know, these are best practices that are rolled up into the standard, which is beneficial to any data center anywhere in the world. So those are the two topics that we covered up until now. Let's shift gears and talk about Windows Azure. And somebody came up to me in the previous session that I was doing that, Vishwas, I liked that you broke Windows Azure platform down into 3 buckets, because it can be daunting to people who are getting started at all the number of services that you see. So this slide is really about placing all of the Windows Azure services into 3 buckets. And in this session, we will be focusing on the green bucket here, if you will. But it is from an overview perspective, I think it is important to understand the 3 buckets or containers. Let's start from the bottom, or the green container here. It represents compute. So it represents compute, it represents networking, it represents CDN nodes and things like traffic manager. If you are wanting to build an application which automatically sends your users to the different location or does failover, you would use traffic manager, for example. That's the infrastructure part. Everything is built on top of that. On top of that is data. So you have, of course, the SQL, Azure SQL database, which is database as a service. And you can, of course, launch a VM and install SQL Server on it. In fact, you don't even have to install SQL Server. You can get a gallery image with SQL Server pre-installed. And then you have a bunch of app services, and the box up at the top keeps growing. New services keep coming all the time. And you could take advantage of cloud services. We talked about web and worker roles. You're trying to build a backend for your mobile applications, you would use mobile services. If you're doing high compute analysis, you would do HPC. If you're doing big data analysis, you would use a Hadoop implementation called HD Analytics. So there are a bunch of services that are built on top, but they're all built in this manner. They're all built on the green box and then the orange box, and then that enables all of these services. Okay, so I'm done with my concept slides. Let's now focus on the topic at hand, which is Windows Azure in the enterprise. And to bring out this topic, what we have done is we have created a demo setup. Right? And this demo setup is going to be common across all the demonstrations that you see for the rest of this session. And this is what the demo looks like. And let me get myself. Is it in PowerPoint 2013? Okay, so that's fine. Zoom works. Okay, fine. So what is happening here is just a quick description. You will see that we have deployed assets in 2 data centers. We have deployed it in the US East data center, and there are a bunch of assets. There will be some web applications, some databases, and we have deployed some assets in the US West Coast data center. Okay? And then Jack and I work out of Reston, Virginia. And in our Reston, Virginia office, we have a small on-premises network. And then we have a hardware device which establishes a site-to-site connectivity between the two data centers. Okay? So think of the two data centers, and then think of back in our Reston office, we have a small network of machines. And as part of that network, we have a hardware appliance. That hardware appliance establishes a site-to-site tunnel to the East Coast and sets up a site-to-site tunnel to the West Coast. Okay? And if for those who are not exactly following, what does he mean by site-to-site tunnel? Let me boil it down further. So essentially, we have extended the network on our on-premises box to the cloud, which means once the site-to-site tunnel has been established, I can browse machines in the cloud. I can mount a drive on a machine that is in the cloud. Essentially, I have seamless connectivity to my machines inside the cloud. That's what site-to-site connectivity means. And that can be achieved by placing a hardware appliance like a Juniper or a Cisco, or you can do it through our RAS, Windows Server 2012, our RAS, you can do it in this manner as well. So this will be our demo setup. So when I say we deployed this to East Coast, you know this, or West Coast, or when I say I have this non-prem, these are set of machines in our Reston office. Okay? Keep this in mind. We'll come back to this diagram repeatedly throughout this presentation. Now so this presentation is broken up into 4 scenarios. Let's start with the first one, storage, backup, and recovery of your data. Let's talk about that. So before we show you the demonstration, let's talk about storage a little bit. So how are your machines powered, right? When you launch a virtual machine in Windows Azure, where are the data disks and OS disks stored? That is the first question that you have to ask yourself. And turns out that your data disks and your OS disks get stored in something called the Windows Azure blob storage. And that seems, people when they start looking at the virtual machines, it is counterintuitive to them. So you are saying that when I do a write to my disk, that write is actually happening to a storage service which is located elsewhere? And the answer is yes. So the next question is, are you out of your mind? Because every time I'm doing some operation, you have to propagate that change. Well, for things that can be cached or cacheable, then there is a way to cache those changes locally on that disk, on that virtual machine. And when it makes sense, you can propagate these changes to the cloud. But for things that are not cacheable, for example, you never want, let's say you inserted a record into your database, you don't want to be cached in the machine. What if that machine dies? The whole cloud model is based on buying this commodity hardware. And you have a redundancy done at a different level. What if you do a database write and that machine dies? So you never want to cache that insert, you want to propagate that up to the cloud. So key thing to take away from this is your virtual machines, hard disk and data disk are stored in the blob storage. And blob storage is not something, it is petabytes worth of storage. In fact, there was a count just recently, it has now 4 trillion objects, which, we're not talking about what size is, but 4 trillion by itself is a large number. And the way it is off, so how do you get redundancy out of that, right? I create a virtual machine, I go to my C drive or maybe a data drive and I create a file, and what if that hard drive fails? How do I get protection? Well, it turns out that Windows Azure Storage maintains 3 copies of your data. So they're only charging you for 1, but it maintains 3 copies. Every time you do a write, they're updating the 2 secondaries. And if the primary fails for some reason, they will promote one of the secondary as a primary. And not only that, they will, and this animation will show you that, but they also replicate your data to a data center which is 400 miles or more away. Okay? So you are writing these disks, you are creating a virtual machine, you are backing them into a blob storage, and that blob storage is auto-replicated to another data center. So the East Coast data center is being replicated to West Coast data center, and this replication duration is about, there's a lag of 15 minutes, or it could be less, but there's a lag. So if there is a disaster situation, Microsoft can say that all of the storage is pointed to the other data center, and you can have access to your data in that manner. And right now, as an application, you don't have access to that data. Microsoft has to turn some knob for a disaster recovery situation for you to have access to that data. But the point is that your data is being replicated. So what we want to talk about, and I'll let Jack come on here in a second. There's one interesting solution that many of our customers are looking into, and there's an appliance called Store Simple, which actually Microsoft ended up buying this startup. And it's a very interesting appliance. It is designed to be a SAN-like storage appliance which you can drop in your network. And based on how often a data is getting used, you can turn some knobs and say that 2-week data is old or 3-week data is old. Based on those knobs that you turn and based on the usage patterns, what this device does is, it takes this data and the data that is less often used, it pushes it to the blob storage for you, and then brings it back when you need it. And it does so in a secure manner. It actually encrypts the data and sends it. So you write to that device, it is part of your network, you write to that device in a, it has all the SSD backed, high-tech appliance, you get the low latency writes. But then if you're not using the data, it will seamlessly take your data and move it to the cloud and bring it back when you need to. So think that's another option. But Jack, why don't you come up and then show us this backup manager solution?
Let me just take a step back real quick. We talked a little bit about the public cloud, but we didn't talk about the private cloud. So in this first scenario, we're really talking about the private cloud. Hyper-V, Virtual Machine Manager, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with those concepts, but the idea is to try to be as efficient as possible in not only the public cloud, but in the private cloud. So the first thing we're talking about is the private cloud and how you can take a first step and maybe back up some of your resources that are running in the private cloud into Azure. So, and the first thing we're talking about is basically what I just did is I saved the wait time. I just went ahead and RDP'd into one of our Azure machines. That's running in the East Coast. It's an Active Directory box. So from there.
So remember the diagram that I showed you? East Coast data center, West Coast. All he did was, by virtue of that tunnel that we have set up, he just RDP'd into one of the boxes in Azure, and that's what you're seeing here right now.
This is, now I've jumped into the on-prem Active Directory box, which is, as you can see up here, see that. And from there, I'm going into my Hyper-V Virtual Machine Manager server. So I just wanted to quickly show you that we're running basically a private cloud here. We've got a Hyper-V machine on-prem. I call it System Center App Controller 02. And on top of that, we're running Virtual Machine Manager, which is right here. I've got a cloud called AIS Demos. That represents my private cloud. So I've got that going. So just wanted to give you a little background on that. Now, I'm going to jump over and show you the first thing, which is a lot of folks run Data Protection Manager, which is part of System Center. Here is, I'm not sure how many people know this, but in Data Protection Manager, there's now integrated Azure backup capabilities. So you can back up straight from Data Protection Manager to the private cloud, and you can do things like backup virtual machines. So here I went ahead and did that. I integrated my Data Protection Manager server into Azure, and as you can see, there's some space that's been used, but not some backups. So if I come back into protection, you can see here's my protection group. So basically what you do is you register your server in Azure. And it's basically you're swapping certificates with the Azure environment, so it's a trusted connection. And this does not depend on the virtual private network that Vishwas was mentioning before. So if I come in here, and say modify protection group, you can see that I've selected a couple of machines. And these are basically running. They're running on my Hyper-V box, so basically I'm using volume shadow copy services. And then these are the 2 boxes I've picked. So I'm basically taking these 2 servers and I'm backing them up locally and I'm backing them up into Azure. So you can see that right here it says I want to back up online. Then there's, I'm sorry, you can set retention schedules. And basically you can say, you want to back up online.
No, so let me also, when Jack showed me some of these demos, I asked him a lot of developer type questions. So let me also provide you the answers that he gave me and sort of help you translate some of the things that he showed. So what was interesting about this is we don't have that store simple appliance, but what he did really was, he talked about private cloud, and let me give you my spin on private cloud. So in addition to provisioning these machines in the cloud, we also have a private cloud setup, which means we can provision machines locally in our data center. And we have to do that for certain reasons, because certain kinds of projects that we do, the client is not interested in provisioning that virtual machine to the public cloud. Right? They would say, you can do that in your private cloud, but don't take this machine out in the public cloud. So what we do is, we use the technology, as Jack mentioned, called the Virtual Machine Manager. And we go to Virtual Machine Manager and say, please give us a virtual machine, please give us a virtual machine. And we try to get a similar experience as you would get from Azure, where go into Azure and get yourself a virtual machine. Okay? So I'll come to that in a second, just make one quick point. So that's the private cloud. It does not have infinite elasticity like the public cloud, but we can still get the agility of spinning up these virtual machines. What Jack was demonstrating for us was this private cloud, some of these machines which we were allowed to do, he was backing these machines out to the blob storage or the storage in the cloud. Okay? And what was interesting, and I didn't realize till I was playing with these tools, is as Microsoft is moving towards integrating the on-premises experience, and that's why the stock is Azure and the enterprise, they are building a lot of these capabilities into their existing tools. So if you looked at the same tool 2 years back, Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, if you looked at this tool 2 years back, there was no option to say right-click and back up to Azure. So this was sort of the highlight of this demonstration, that you can go to your virtual machine that you provision using Virtual Machine Manager and say, I want to back this up in the cloud. And why did we select this example? Let's just take a step back and, fine, Vishwas, I can store my data in the cloud. Why are you telling me this? Okay, so let me just sort of draw a big picture. The big picture argument here is that as enterprises look at Windows Azure, they're not going to Windows Azure all in, that I'm going to take all my workloads and move to the cloud, right? Some companies are saying, all I want to do is use Windows Azure for my storage for now and see how it works out, and then I will incrementally add additional workloads. So in our session here, we are building on those scenarios. The first one was set up a private cloud, and then I can simply, all I'm using the Windows Azure is for backup protection in the cloud. If something goes wrong, my machine dies, I have a backup in the cloud, I can bring it back and resurrect my machine. And the last thing I would say about this is, in terms of tooling, if you look at, how many of you have installed SQL Server 2014 or played with it a little bit? Not too many people. If you install SQL Server 2014, you will see a lot of these Azure backup capabilities baked into the product. So you can, when you install SQL 2014, you can right-click and say, back this database up into Azure and do this at this rate and do it hourly or do it nightly and things like that. That tooling is sort of built into SQL Server. Make sense? Yes, sir. Question? Oh, no.
Maybe you'll answer.
Are you sure? I was, okay, fine. So that was, go ahead.
So there's 2 other scenarios, right? That's Data Protection Manager backing up into Azure. There's also the Azure backup. There's an agent you can install on servers and go ahead and just back up straight to Azure as well. And then the third option, as Vishwas mentioned, this is a SQL 2014 server, and I've created a maintenance plan And if you look at my maintenance plan here, you can see that I've got credentials, and I'm basically backing up to a blob in Azure here.
It's hard for people to see. It's hard to zoom into a remote desktop session. And refresh rate just does not permit you to zoom in easily. SQL is local, and then you're backing the SQL up through the built-in tools into Azure.
So right in the maintenance plan, there's a wizard. You don't have to swap certificates in this scenario. Basically, you come right in here and you can set it up straight away with SQL.
Go ahead.
So basically, you will do something like that for performance from your local cloud, because I'm thinking like main, I guess, reason why we're not going anything with cloud storage or public cloud is because of data, so security and worries. And so now here you're still providing the data to cloud. Right? So what is one, like why would you just go to the cloud rather than performance?
Good question. I think I understand your question. Your question is, Vishwas, if you are taking the data to the cloud, why do you need these machines locally? Right? So this is, many companies are looking at this as a disaster recovery solution. See, they don't want to operate in the cloud for long periods of time. They just want to use it as a disaster recovery setup. If something goes horribly wrong here, I want to be able to at least run it temporarily and then I'll bring everything back. See, I now have the ability to ship disks to them and get disks back from them. They just announced it. So I will run temporarily for however long I have to run and then I'll get the data back, because setting up disaster recovery is very expensive. Most companies don't have it, and this is a good scenario for that. And the second one, as you alluded to, is performance. Right? I still want my data close to my application. My application can't leave my premises. So I want to do this locally, but I want to take that one aspect of the cloud, which is low-cost storage, and want to take advantage of that. Okay? So Jack, should we move to the next item?
Real quick. So all it takes to do this is to come into data services and say, you can click on recovery services, and you can create a backup vault. And then if you come in here, you can see that I've got two backup vaults. One of them is for data protection manager, and one of them is for the backup agent that runs on Windows. The third one we demonstrated is the SQL backup. And if you could have seen that URL, it goes straight to blob storage, so you can see that here's my backup straight away in a container and blob storage. So I just wanted to mention that. That's how it works.
Let's go back to the slides. We have lots of scenarios here. So this was the first scenario, probably the simplest scenario, and I think that's an excellent question to why we are doing this. Okay, keep moving. The next scenario is dev and test, and this is a very popular scenario. I think many of our developers are doing that, many of our customers are doing that. You want to set up dev and test in the cloud. You're not quite ready to go to the full production boxes in the cloud for compliance and security reasons. But you want to, even our stringent customers who have stringent compliance needs are willing to allow us to run dev tests in the cloud. So for example, our SharePoint projects, we will create a SharePoint farm on the fly. So we will go to Azure and create 3 machines, add them into, install AD on it, install SQL Server, install SharePoint. I mean, these are PowerShell scripts. And in fact, Microsoft has published some of those scripts, and we have taken some of those scripts and added some stuff that we needed on top of that. So here's how it works, and as developers, you'll appreciate this. And SharePoint is just one example. It could apply to the application that you're working on, which is you do a nightly build, and as you extend your nightly build to take the bits, kick off a PowerShell script that goes to your Azure subscription, provisions 3 machines, installs the right software on it through PowerShell, and once you've created that farm, whether it is an ASP.NET farm or SharePoint, you take the build output, go deploy it, and then you basically email out the URLs and login credentials to your test team. You can come in and do a test on the test data. And this itself has been hard, because what if you wanted to do load testing? What if you want a different setup? What if you wanted to test code on a multi-web front-end solution? All of those scenarios are possible at a low cost, because as soon as the testing is done, you can simply take those machines offline and stop paying for that. And I'm sure many of you have seen the new Visual Studio load test service, where you must have gone to other session where you can write a Visual Studio test and then give it to the load test service and load test your installation. And to be able to do that, you have to scale up your stage and test environments, and you can do that in this scenario. So in fact, Jack, you have that set up, what we do for our developers. Bring that up, and let me just describe that. So one thing that, this is the tool that we built internally for ourselves. So what happens typically is, if you are joining a new team, you have a bunch of things that you need to install, right? So your team lead, you go meet your team lead, and your team lead will say, you're going to work on the CRM application, or you're going to work on this SharePoint application, and install all the software, and get it up and running, and install Visual Studio, and it takes you 2 or 3 days if you're lucky to get all of that set up and be productive on that team, right? And we wanted to sort of reduce that curve. So what we did was, so a team lead would go in and create a project-specific template library in Azure, okay? And this is a custom screen that we built, and we federated it with our Windows Azure Active Directory, so that our employees don't have to remember a new set of credentials. They remember the same credentials. They come in, they select the image that they want, and you're familiar with the MSDN discounts that Microsoft is offering. If you're an MSDN subscriber, and we buy MSDN for our employees, if you're an MSDN subscriber, you get, based on the type of MSDN you've bought, you get 100, 150 or whatever number of dollars of Azure resources for free every month. And what we do here is have a central library of images. And Jack, can you walk them through this demonstration? Just walk as if you are a new developer joining a new team.
Well, so I've already logged on, and some of the preliminary steps are to basically take your profile information from your subscription and register it into the console so that it knows who you are. So as you can see here, it says select a destination storage account. There's only one here because I've already identified myself in the portal. This is a website running on Azure as well.
That's right.
Using Windows Azure Active Directory, as Vishwas mentioned. So basically, this is in a shared subscription so that we can have the catalog available. But every one of our developers has an MSDN license with benefits, as Vishwas mentioned. So the idea here is you select the image you need, and then you basically select copy. And what it does is it basically copies it into my Windows subscription on Azure's back end, so that it's not basically uploading from my desktop or any other location. It's actually going from the centralized catalog into the MSDN subscription for the user on the Azure backplane. So it's actually very fast.
I mean, we're talking 120 gig or 150 gig images copied in 10 minutes because you're doing server to server copy, and you're not paying any egress charges because you are going within the data center across different subscriptions. Okay? What we are finding, and more people in the company are using it, because that time that used to take like 2 or 3 days to get your machine up and running and configured is now down to like 2 hours. You come in, you copy this image, you create a virtual machine, and Jack, it will be useful. Do you have the Windows Azure portal here? Can you just show them, for some of the people who have not seen this, just don't go ahead and create a new virtual machine, but just go through the first 4 steps. So I've taken half an hour for the team lead created image to copy to my account, and then what happens? Can you show them? Can you go to the portal, please?
So we've done the copy. Then if you notice, here's the actual image in the library, in the container where we copied it to. So then you basically come in and say new, go to compute, go to virtual machine, so you select from gallery, then I go down to my disks, I simply select the image.
See that image showed up here, that was copied, showed up here, and now you can create a virtual machine based on this disk.
So then I can choose the virtual machine name and the size, and then continue on. And then once you finish, it spins up the virtual machine, and you can already be into it and begin work, which is fantastic.
Which is great. So we've reduced that 3 days time to 2 hours, which is great. And one other thing that made it possible, I think it's worth mentioning, is in addition to virtualization of computation, which you can do in the private cloud by running Hyper-V yourself, there is a virtualization of networking that's going on. See, you have your own private network. If you tried this within your firewall, you would have machine name conflicts all over the place, right? If you gave your VHD to someone and they booted on the same network, these two machines have the same name and have all kinds of conflicts. Because each subscription is running in its own network boundary, you don't care about the machine name conflicts. So that's one other important point to take away, that virtualization of network is important too. So this is becoming an important thing now. One thing, one lesson learned is that $100, $150 is good if you are diligent about, after you're done working for 8, 9, whatever hours you're working, you need to shut these machines down, right? If you leave them running 24/7 for 30 days, then the bill will be a hefty bill at the end of the month. And there are some interesting things that you have to know about. For example, if you just directly RDP to that machine and shut that machine down, Microsoft doesn't count that as a shutdown and will continue to charge you. You have to go through the portal or the API to shut that machine down. So we have done some interesting things in this tool that we can tell people that you've been working for 8 hours, go take a break. No, remember to shut that machine down. I mean, they could be working for 10 hours during their course of the day, but at least they're cognizant of the fact that the machine has been on for 8 hours. Okay, makes sense? Is that making sense? So everybody see that progression? The first step was, I really don't want to move any applications to the cloud. I just want to use this as a disaster recovery setup because I really can't afford to have another data center. And I can buy an appliance, or I can use the new set of tools, or I can use some wizards to do that. You get past that, you come to stage number 2. I am not quite ready to move my production workloads to the cloud, but maybe I can just move my dev and test scenarios to the cloud. Okay? So that's, yes sir, go ahead.
Question along the same lines. What if I have websites and I have SQL Server on premise,
Yes.
right? But I'm not ready to move my SQL Server into the cloud.
Yes.
But I want to run my websites, my production websites from the cloud. What about, can you have like a private tunnel that goes from your SQL Server on premise to your
Good
website?
question. Good question.
Is there latency problems or performance issues?
So let me tease that question to really the two parts to that question. One is, when you say Azure, when you say websites, are you specifically talking about the Azure website product, or are you talking about generically any website?
Well, taking my existing website that's on premise
Okay.
and putting
Absolutely.
it in the
You
cloud.
can do that. In fact, we will just show you an example of that. You can do that. Once you have set up a VPN tunnel, any traffic can flow over that tunnel. Okay? But you're absolutely right that you have to look at the type of application. If that application is very chatty, for example, then having that latency does not make sense. For example, if you install SharePoint in the cloud, and if you had the domain controller on premises, it would not work because there's heavy interaction going on between Active Directory and SharePoint. So typically when you install SharePoint in the cloud, you put a read-only copy or an Active Directory instance in the cloud co-located with the SharePoint server. It really depends on the type of application. You're running a SQL Server application, and if you have coarse grained operations on that, you may get away with that. Because the tunnel can be, it will depend on the latency of the tunnel, and something interesting is happening there too. If you are not happy routing the traffic over public internet, like the tunnel is really a VPN connection over the public internet. If you want a low latency connection, they just announced with AT&T something called MPLS, which is you can get a private leased line from your data center, which never touches the internet, into their data center directly. And you can have a low latency connection in that line. And so there's some announcements that have been made in the last few weeks that you can take advantage of. But we will come to that in a moment. Was there another question before I move to scenario number 3? Yes, sir.
Just I think that's a great idea with the developer images. How do you find licensing in terms of making sure that you have licenses available?
Good question. Yeah. So the model works for us because we have MSDN licenses for all of our developers.
What about other products besides Microsoft?
What about products besides
You have a
Microsoft?
developer image that has a footprint that's outside of Microsoft.
Yeah, it has to be carefully managed, and a lot of vendors are going in for like, you can, SQL Server, for example, is an interesting example to consider. You can either get your volume license of SQL Server and move it to the cloud, or you can use it as a part of your MSDN. But you could also get an hourly usage pricing for SQL Server as well. And some vendors are offering that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we use a lot of things like Redgate, Scooter software, JetBrains, all those other products that wrap around helping you
Yeah,
develop.
you have to, I mean, the same rules apply as they do in on-premises world where you can't copy images and stuff. If you do, you have to be cognizant of these licensing considerations, absolutely.
I think what you're asking, I guess, is like, if you have multiple keys, right, if you just copy the boxes and have the same keys. is it-
Well, I mean, yeah, but just, you have the provision for licensing. As soon as you start using that image, a lot of ULAs require you to have a license when you start to work on it.
Yeah.
So you just have to have a bank of licenses.
Yeah, I mean, you have to bank licensing, you have to track how many images you're doing, and we track how many people have copied this image and all of that.
That's the kind of thing, right? To make
Yes.
sure you're.
So every copy operation, in fact, I was asking Jack the other day, how many people have used this image? And it was easy enough to go back to a table storage where we keep a copy of how many people have made a copy of this image, and furthermore, instantiated machines based on that. So I mean, some of those licensing stuff is again the same as on-premises, but I do agree that it makes it easier to copy it in this manner, that people seem to believing that things are simpler at the licensing level than they're not. But the thing is that many vendors are actually going into this model of pay me by the hour of usage.
Yeah, that was my question. Are you starting to see a trend?
Yes,
Of that?
absolutely, absolutely.
Small. So I find even working on local VMs, it's really painful for me as a developer. If I'm very performance sensitive, how do you find the performance of those remote boxes?
Okay, so let me repeat the question for the benefit of the recording and for others in the room. The real question is, I am very performance sensitive, and I find that even the VMs running locally on my quad-core machines sometimes not performant enough. And how is that working in Windows Azure? I would say that they've added us new compute instances, which are like high memory instances. And they have a naming scheme for that, A5, A6, and stuff like that. We have had positive reaction from our developers that they are able to do SharePoint development in the cloud. People love it, that they can bring it up quickly, they can develop it from anywhere, they can have multiple machines, shut one down, use it. So the flexibility, but none of that would matter if the performance was not good enough. And the fact that over 100 developers have switched to that model tells me that they're finding it acceptable.
We don't have a lot of complaints about latency or bandwidth issues.
And we sort of, we were concerned about that, and we didn't sort of make it mandatory that you have to have this VM. And we had this service, and then people who want to opt into this model could opt in, and others could just get a nice beefy laptop like that. And we find that a lot of people are moving to that model because they like that ability to get the latest images and stuff.
But obviously,
So,
this weighs.
this weighs a lot. And the power supply is embarrassing sometimes. And I tell people that there's an LED screen behind that, and that's my screen. And yeah, but I take it on the plane, but I remote desktop from my phone. I leave it up in the storage shelf. I'm just kidding. Okay, let's keep moving. Was there a question? Yes, please. Go ahead, sir.
My question right now, we have one physical server and one team is sharing that one development server, the remote desktop. So, if we choose to move to the cloud, do we need to have each developer their own virtual machine, or like one VM can be shared by the developers?
So it's a good question. It can be shared, right? I mean, you can, like you have a network here. In fact, just hang on to your question. You will see in the third example, we are extending your network to the cloud, so you can have a shared resource or give them their individual resource. You have the flexibility of doing both.
For the development workload, though, we find typically that developers, especially for SharePoint, want their own image. They don't step on each other as they do things like IS resets or STSAD commands that refresh the apples and things like that. So we typically want to dedicate a virtual machine to a developer for that reason.
And I think this was not explicitly stated, but there is a machine VM portability, so you can go with the model of running the virtual machine on your laptop, just copy that image up to Windows Azure, boot a machine off of that, and for some reason you don't like that experience, you can take that image and copy it back down. So there's portability across these images. Let's look at the extend your infrastructure, number 3. And this is where we start getting into the VPN tunnel. So, Jack, I think I've already introduced this topic. Why don't you show them the demo, because we're running out of time. We have about 20 minutes left, and we have two more sessions to do, or 2 more demos to do. So very quickly, the concept behind this demonstration that you're going to see is that little subnet that is back in the Reston office has a VPN tunnel to the East Coast and West Coast. And by virtue of that, you can do some things like mount a drive. And Jack, can you show us that?
So basically I wanted to quickly go into the Azure portal and go over a few basic concepts. Here's one.
Jack and I work on many different Azure projects, so we have many subscriptions. And just recently there was a change in this portal that you can only connect to one Active Directory instance. You saw the notion of directories, you have to say which directory. So you just switch directory. Can you see the networks now? Cool.
So here's my networks, and again, there's quite a few.
Can you zoom it? Zoom it.
There's quite a few, but the one but I basically wanted to go and show you first local networks. And so when you set up these IPsec tunnels, whether you're doing one or many, you first set up your local network, which represents your on-prem environment. You can see I set up an address, a pool of IP addresses for that network. There's a gateway address, and then it's basically there's a subscription. We also set up DNS servers, and I'll show you the rest of this. So here's my on-prem environment. I mentioned that. Here's my East Coast representation in Azure. And you can see, if I come into configure, you can see on-prem there. You can see in the East Coast, I've set up DNS servers, and there's my local network. And you can see that I have an address space as well below here. 2 that I've created in the gateway address space for the actual IPsec tunnel. So here you can see that the actual gateway is connected, and here's a bunch of machines that are in Azure that are sitting in that virtual network.
So you're picking the subnet?
Yeah. You can pick a subnet in one place, the box, and then you create it.
So you can provide an IP range, and your machines in Azure will be based on that IP range.
And those IPs stick with the machine? Or do they change?
Right, so I think the question is, if those machines are rebooted, will they get that same IP address? Yes, by virtue of being part of the VNet, when those machines are booted up, those IPs are retained.
If you were to delete and recreate, it's obviously another IP.
If you delete the machine and recreate it, that should be fine. I think as long as it is connected to the VNet, right, Jack?
They persist. There's a
Yeah. If you delete the cloud service itself and then recreate it, then it's different. If you delete the VNet and then recreate the VNet and add machines, then it's different.
Yeah, I just meant the VM within.
Yeah.
Within the VM.
So I'm not going to go into the same detail, but we also have a West Coast data center, and you can see it's connected to the on-prem environment as well.
So what you're seeing here is the Windows Azure portal, and you see 2 networks, one network to East Coast, one network to West Coast, and the green thing tells us that things are working fine if the connection was down. Somebody disconnected the the appliance that we have back in the restaurant office, there'll be this big red mark there saying this connection is done. Why can you show some like mapping of drive and stuff? Is that what you're planning to show?
So I connected into an Azure Active Directory box that's in the East Coast. Then I went ahead and I RDP'd into my on-prem Active Directory server. And that's where I'm doing all my connections to the local servers that are on-prem. So as Vishwas mentioned, I can quickly just, this is connecting through the Azure East Coast Active Directory server into an on-prem Active Directory server and mapping a drive back to the Azure East Coast domain. And this one's going to the West Coast. So you can see that the IPsec tunnels are there, traffic flows. It's just basically showing you that the networks are there, they're yours, you're connecting into them. You've created the IP address space. It's basically your extended network into the East Coast and West Coast, which is really compelling.
Go ahead.
How are you setting up your VPN gateway? Because I've always heard that from getting that set up is always a tricky part. Is that?
So originally we had a TMG server we used for this demo, and we're now using a Cisco router. And when you go into the portal and you create the VPN, they'll actually give you a script for creating the IPsec tunnels. And there's lots of documentation on setting up the IPsec tunnels.
Did you find it challenging, or?
It's not challenging for Jack, but if I could do it, it means it can be done. I mean, for him, it was, he could go through all these settings. But things have improved quite a bit, especially the scripts that he's talking about. You can go and tell them the device type. They give you back a script.
It makes it very easy. Some of it, you've got routing that you can do as well if you want the traffic to flow properly. So there's, it's not only the IPsec tunnel, but you have to set up the routing as well so that the traffic will.
Right.
So basically, as you've seen, we've basically extended the network. I showed you the connectivity.
By the way, is anybody as excited about mounting a drive as I am, or am I being? I think as boring as this demo is, when you say, Vishwas, why are you excited about / machine name and mapping a drive? I mean, what's a big deal? Big deal is this, that you are treating an Azure-based resource like a resource on your on-prem environment. And that's the real thing, that now you can treat those boxes as your own and you can manage them in a central way. That's really the power of the platform, of playing it. Yes, sir.
What application services and classes can you access that? Windows Azure class from the previous application, from the previous demo, can you access that stuff there?
Good question. So the question is that, Vishwas, you showed us this in the previous session. I showed you a service bus demo for those who are here. There's this MongoDB and service bus. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I heard your question was, could I have done service bus using the VPN tunnel as well?
Right, so if I have some staff that wants to use the bus in a local, like on a local.
Yes. So I could have used the VPN tunnel to have a local MongoDB instance and have the service bus talk to the MongoDB. But you raise a very interesting question, because what we are talking about here is a network, pretty low-level connectivity at a network level, right? In some cases, they will not let you set up a VPN connection for whatever reason, right? They'll say, we don't like Cisco device to be put in our network because we only certify only one kind of device. There's things. So Service Bus offers this application level connectivity too, without having a network level connectivity in place. And I was explaining earlier that there's this concept of a relay. So what you can do is, if you don't have a VPN tunnel set up, right, and let's say you have a SQL server which is running on premises, and you don't want to put that SQL server on a DNZ because it has some sensitive data in it, and you are not allowed to set up a VPN tunnel. How do you run an ASP.NET application in the cloud that gets data from the SQL server? And one of the scenarios you can do there is, using Service Bus, it allows you application level connectivity. And the concept is very simple. What you do is you open an outbound connection to Service Bus, and the on-premises box opens an on-premises outgoing connection to the Service Bus, And service bus is acting as a socket-to-socket forwarder, and the traffic is going tunneling over HTTP or HTTPS. So you can do that as well.
Is there a performance hit on that?
There is a performance hit on that, surely, because now you're going through the tunneling and you have one more level of interaction. But if that's the only option, in fact, we were working on a project at the Department of Treasury where we were doing a SharePoint implementation. Cloud was nowhere in the picture, and we were tasked to do that SharePoint work. And then they had a need to connect this SharePoint environment with a public-facing CRM site. And how do you do that securely? They would never allow you to do VNet or opening of firewall ports. And we showed them the service bus level connectivity. And they were first concerned about what ports are you opening, and when they did the port scanning, realized really no ports were being opened. They were willing to go with that solution.